Hi, thank you so much for joining this evening and welcome to the Hudson Library's author series. So nice to see so many of you here. I hope you had a chance before we get started to enter the raffle for this evening. I'm going to be calling it before we go to the book signing tonight, so make sure you have your ticket. Thank you, Gwen. Also, hope you had a chance to take up one of our monthly brochures to see what's coming up here at the Hudson Library. We have so many exciting events coming up. I know Saturday there's a virtual tour where a tour guide's going to walk you around live for Salzburg for a tour of Austria month. We have so much exciting stuff going on here, so I hope you check it out, and we hope to see you again here soon. There is going to be a Q&A session after today, so make sure you have your questions ready, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So, let's go ahead and get started. All right. So Ray Isle is one of the wine world's most foremost writers and speakers. He has been writing about wine, spirits, and cocktails for over 20 years. He regularly appears on national television and other media and speaks at wine and food events around the globe. He is a longtime executive wine editor at Food & Wine, as well as the wine and spirits editor for Travel and Leisure. He writes What to Drink Next, and I also particularly love your article on chips pairings in wine. I was like, well, that is genius. He is a three-time nominee for a James Beard Award in beverage writing. He has won American Food Journalist Award for beverage writing, North American Travel Journalists Association Gold Award, and his newest book is The World in a Wineglass, which is a fantastic book if you haven't got a chance to check it out. So thank you so much, Ray, for joining us this evening.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to meet you. This is great. I'm thrilled to be here. It's such a great crowd, and a really great day outside too. It was wonderful. So I thought what I'd do is talk and read a bit. I'll read some things from the book. Some of you may have read some of it. I doubt anybody's read all of it yet because it's like hefty. But I'll read a little bit from the book and I'll talk a little bit, and then we'll have some Q&A. And the Q&A can be about the book, or it can be about anything you want to know about wine, or really anything in the world that I don't necessarily know that I can answer it if it's like particle physics or something, but I'll give it a shot. This book, it took me about 3 years to write, but it kind of took my whole career to put it together. And if you haven't looked at it yet, it's a look at wine through a couple of lenses, in a sense. It's one, looking at wineries around the world that are working in sustainable or organic or regenerative farming, essentially that are trying to make wines that express a kind of personal vision and a sense of place. If we think about wine, and I'll get to this in a second when I read the first part of the book, but wine is fermented grape juice, but in theory, wine can express the place it's from and the vision of the person making it. It's a little bit more, I think, interesting or complex than Coca-Cola. Much as I like a Diet Coke, I actually think Diet Dr. Pepper is the supreme soft drink, but what can you do? Yeah, I'm a Dr. Pepper. I grew up in Texas. What can I say? And so I did that, and I wanted to do a book that kind of looked at the entire world rather than just concentrating on one region, because I'm a generalist at Food & Wine. I don't concentrate on Spain or on France. I write literally about everything. My columns can be anything from, great Burgundies to super wines for grilling to boxed wines to $100 Napa Cabernets. It goes all over the place. And I think that's important in the world of wine because there's so much wine out there that's fascinating. And I'll read a little bit of the start of the book just to give you a sense of what I was after and what I was talking about. But there's a quote right at the beginning that I like. It's from an author, Colette, if anybody knows Colette. She was a French writer in the sort of early part of the 20th century. And she was mostly known for her novels, but she did have a couple of memoirs. And she spent actually a fair amount of time at one winery, that's Chateau Tivin, that's in Beaujolais, that's in the book. And she wrote, there's a line in one of her memoirs from the time she was staying there that the vine and the wine it produces are two great mysteries. Alone in the vegetable kingdom, the vine makes the true savor of the earth intelligible to man. With what fidelity it makes the translation. It senses then expresses in its clusters of fruit the secrets of the soil. And that was, I had a couple of quotes that were kind of guiding posts for this book, and that was one of the ones that sort of, when I think about wine, that's what I think about, is that you've got this plant and it's producing grapes, but it's kind of taking the character of the earth up through the vine in a sense. So this is just the beginning couple of pages of the book. What is wine? Well, say, if you like, that it's just fermented grape juice. Fair enough, you're totally right. But that's also like saying a knife is just a sharp piece of metal. There's a world of difference between a machine-stamped blade with a polypropylene handle and a carbon steel chef's knife that's made by a master craftsman. So too with wine. At its best, wine is an artisanal creation that edges toward and possibly sometimes achieves art. Wine's an alcoholic beverage, no question there, yet we drink it to amplify the pleasure of a meal and to heighten the joy of connecting with other people, rather than simply to achieve a buzz. Wine is fermented grape juice, but when it's made with grapes grown in carefully chosen locations, fermented and aged with intelligence, experience, and skill, it can be something much greater than that. At its heart, wine is also an agricultural product. One sip of a great wine will tell you what kind of grapes went into it, where they were grown, even what the weather was like that year. The perfect temperatures in July in Napa Valley, or the rain in Piedmont in September, the frost in April in the Loire Valley, all of those can reveal themselves, for better or worse, in a single sip, even more than they would if you were to eat the grape itself. Wine's alchemical magic, the translation of the juice to grapes by fermentation, the transformation of the juice of the grapes by fermentation, somehow brings a mysteriously microscopic focus to all the broader influences of season, soil, and plant. Wine is grape juice transformed by yeast, guided by the human hand. But the truth is that most of the wine in the world doesn't really summon that magic. While it does come from grapes that grew on vines, a vast percentage of the wine in the world is a mass-produced product that bears a little more resemblance to a can of Coke than it does to something handcrafted and distinctive. Its success is measured in the number of units moved off grocery store shelves, its market penetration, its profitability. It's differentiated into price segments: value, premium, ultra-premium, luxury, alarmingly like something you'd get at a gas station pump. That's not to say that this kind of mass-produced wine doesn't taste good. It often does, but then so do Taco Bell tacos. And I'm going to take a side note here. I really like Taco Bell tacos. I think, along with Diet Dr. Pepper, they're the apogee of fast food. And Taco Bell tacos taste great. So why shouldn't they? Taco Bell tacos are designed by very smart people, or if you prefer, quote, food innovation experts, end quote. They satisfy any number of deep-seated flavor cues. They're savory and salty and meaty and cheesy, and they're seasoned with 7, quote, authentic, unquote, spices and seasonings. It makes me wonder, what is an inauthentic spice? They're delightfully crunchy. They even have a lab that tests the crunch factor of the Taco Bell shells, and it's like they test what is the pounds per square inch that is most appealing to the human palate. Of course, they're delightfully crunchy. They remind me of my childhood, a sense of nostalgia. Of course, the Taco Bell innovation team really knows nostalgia. Those sweet days of childhood, crunching tacos in the back of a family car. Well, nostalgia is great if you can wrap it up in paper and sell it for $2.49. I don't mean to beat up on Taco Bell tacos. If it's not clear, I actually like them. As I said, I like them a lot. But like bottles of industrial wine, Taco Bell tacos are sold in the millions, even in the billions. Where do they come from? Who creates them? They emerge from the hatch of the drive-through window, assembled by uniformed workers who, it's safe to say, do not have a personal investment in the farms where that corn and beef came from. What's the source of that crunchy shell? What farmer raised those cows? Who wrote the recipe? Who's the guiding hand? Shareholders, flavor scientists, a CEO? And I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to apologize in advance. If anyone's a big fan of Kim Crawford Sauvignon Blanc, I'm going to take it to task a little bit. But that's not to say it doesn't taste good. I'm just making a point. Here's a kind of thought experiment. Picture a table with 2 bottles sitting in front of you. One, on the left, you have a Kim Crawford Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. Take a sip. odds are you'll think it tastes good, assuming you like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc in the first place, which is a big assumption because some people can't stand New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Let's say you do like it. The wine is brisk and vivid. The flavor recalls a fresh grapefruit. It's appealingly tangy. It whets the appetite, and it costs a moderate $14 or so. It's not odd, and it's not flawed. And yes, Kim Crawford is a real person. I've met him. Marlborough is absolutely a place. It's a wine region on the north coast of New Zealand's South Island, and I've been there. It's plenty of vines. But at this point, the actual Kim Crawford has absolutely nothing to do with Kim Crawford wines. He and his wife, Erica, founded the brand in 1996. In 2003, they sold it to Vincor, a Canadian company, for $49 million. There's zero reason to feel bad for the Crawfords. They're doing fine. In 2006, the international drinks conglomerate Constellation Brands bought Vincor for $1.3 billion. And today, Kim Crawford Wines sells over 1.8 million cases each year in the United States alone. Back in 2019, Constellation announced a marketing campaign for Kim Crawford Wines. Centered on the tag phrase, "Make it amazing." The press release stated, "Make it amazing celebrates the confidence Kim Crawford gives consumers by over-delivering on quality, taste, and value, and brings consumers strong brand loyalty to life. It is supported by a 360-degree integrated marketing plan, including TV and digital advertising, social media content, dynamic displays at retail, strategic partnerships, consumer sampling, and experiential programming." Now let's look at the other bottle on your table. This is a Grey Wacky Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. Same grape, same region. The name refers to a kind of hard sandstone it's called Grey Wacky, that's prevalent in the vineyards that owner Kevin Judd uses for this wine. Judd makes about 40,000 cases each year of his Sauvignon Blanc, which costs $23 a bottle, give or take. He's a smart, sort of taciturn, dryly funny guy who was also the founding winemaker at Cloudy Bay, the winery that effectively put New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc on the map in the early 1990s. Like Kim Crawford, Cloudy Bay was eventually bought by a mega corporation, in its case, LVMH. Judd left soon after. Kevin Judd does not have a 360-degree integrated marketing plan for Grey Wacky. What he does have is a very distinct personal vision of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, and what it can be and what his wines can be. He's involved in every single decision regarding the wine: which vineyards grow the grapes for it, how they're farmed, when the grapes are picked, how the wine is made, how it's aged, when it's released, what the labels look like, what the price is. It's worth pointing out that Grey Wacky Sauvignon Blanc does not come from a single small vineyard. Its production's not super, super tiny, except compared to something like Kim Crawford. You can find it in stores. It's not from an overlooked region in Europe that only a very few wine people, usually in Brooklyn, have heard of. I'm allowed to say that because I live in Brooklyn. It doesn't wear its artisanal nature on its sleeve, but it is what I'd call a real wine. The crucial difference is that the Grey Wacky bottle represents an individual winemaker's distinctive vision of how that specific grape, grown on that specific type of land, can express itself in liquid form. Both the Kim Crawford and the Grey Wacky are wines. There's no question of that. But to me, the Grey Wacky provides some of that unusual mystery that wine can offer, that language that speaks of place and purpose. It expresses something more than just flavor. And the Crawford bottle, well, the label does everything in its power to convince you that the wine inside is distinctive and special. It, quote, dazzles with aromas, bursts with flavor, comes from exceptional vineyards, and we proudly craft it. It's a little unclear who exactly we is. It's the people behind the 360-degree marketing plan. I'm not sure. But it's sort of like a Taco Bell taco. It's tasty, but it's a little soulless. It makes me remember something that Eduard Czepy of the Austrian winery Gut Agau said at a tasting I went to not long ago. Most people just think of wine as a drink. And that makes sense because it's mostly true. With a lot of wine, there's only a distant memory of the soil and the climate in the bottle. It's really just an alcoholic beverage made by some company. Elena Pantaleoni, who's a brilliant idiosyncratic winemaker at La Stoppa in Italy, puts it a little more bluntly when she says, there's a lot of elevator music when it comes to wine. So that's the start of the book. If If you don't like that, then don't read the other 688 pages or whatever. But that's kind of gives you a sense of what I was trying to get at in this book, which to look at wines that really do what made me fall in love with wine, which is really have a personality, have an expression of place, have a passion behind them. I think wine is a really interesting consumer product in a sense because it goes everywhere from $2 a bottle to $5,000 a bottle. It goes everywhere from 1 million case production to 100 or even 10 case production. It walks this line between mass-produced and artisanal in a way. I suppose you could look at it like clothing in a sense, where you've got couture stuff, at super high end, and then you've got off-the-rack stuff that is a $5 T-shirt that was made in China somewhere. But what's interesting about wine is that it doesn't have to be super expensive to be really, really great, which is nice. So I thought, since people usually ask, I'll just tell you a little bit about me, and I'll get it out of the way. So I did not grow up in a wine drinking family. I've been writing about wine for about 25 years now. Good Lord. Yeah, our editor-in-chief at Food and Wine just pointed out that I've been at the magazine 19 years the other day, and I was like, oh my God, that's like 1 million years in magazine years. But I've been writing about wine for about 25 years. I did not grow up with it. I grew up in Texas. The sole moment of excitement around alcohol, other than like alcohol was tasty, but like sort of moment of real alcohol excitement in our house was when finally my dad was like, Coors is going to be available east of the Rockies. And this was game-changing. He'd been waiting for years for Coors to be available in Texas, and it finally came, and he sort of switched from Bud to Coors at that point. That was it. It was occasional whiskey and a lot of beer. Which was fun. And I additionally, like in college, my sole really memory of wine in college was lying on my floor at a party. Actually, it may have been someone else's floor. I'm not entirely sure it was floor. And someone like squeezing wine into my mouth from a bag like up here. And apparently that is a way to become a wine writer. Who knew that this was the qualification? But what happened was I went to grad school. I thought I was going to be an English professor. I thought I would go down an academic path and teach literature. And I was in Boston. And my girlfriend at the time who was also a grad student, worked at this high-end restaurant in Boston. And she actually learned something about wine. And I started, when I would go to hang out at the bar, because I could, and like wait for her to get off work so we could go home, the guys behind the bar pour me a glass of wine. I was like, this stuff's actually pretty good. This is kind of interesting. So I started getting interested in wine. And then several moves later, I ended up in California on another graduate fellowship. And I was in the Bay Area, which put me close to vineyards. And I was kind of buying wine as much as I could. I mean, it's literally like, I would save up I was a grad student. I had no money whatsoever. Like, a burrito at the end of the week we're doing well. And so I would save up and I'd buy wines occasionally at the wine store and talk to the guys at length. And I started going to tastings in Napa back at a time when Napa Valley wine tastings didn't cost $80 a person. And I got really interested in this stuff. And a guy at a store told me, well, you can work bottlings for small wineries and they'll pay you in wine. You show up for a day, slap labels on the bottle, and they'll give you 6 bottles of $50 Napa Cabernet. I was like, cool, great, sounds good. Started doing that. Started getting really interested and thought, well, I'd like to learn more about this. And I basically volunteered as what's called a cellar rat for a couple of years during harvest, which meant hauling barrels, pumping wine, clean, endless. If you want to go into winemaking, you'd better like cleaning. You've got to clean endless amounts of tanks and barrels and hoses and everything. But I was involved in the whole process of making the wine in a very, very minimally or unpaid way. I got to into that, and I was like, I don't want to be in academia. I want to be in wine. For one thing, I've been in English departments, and everybody seems to hate each other all the time. And even when they don't hate each other, they're not very happy. And wine seemed to be full of people who were had some capacity to enjoy life. Even the jerks kind of enjoyed life. And so I switched. And then I would have probably ended up in California, except that I met my now wife, who was in New York and employed and saw little reason to move to California to be with unemployed potential wine guy. It's a hard sell on the romantic front. So I moved to New York, sold wine for a while, kept writing on the side. Eventually, the wine and writing came together, and I've been doing it ever since. And I got very, very fortunate. I feel, I knew one thing I wanted to do, which was write. I had no idea really what I wanted to write about. I fell in love with wine. It turned out the wine and the writing, writing about wine is apparently what I was put on earth to do, which is completely weird. I'm not sure what God or whoever had in mind when he's like, you need to be a wine writer. But it came together, and it came together at a time when magazines were still really flourishing. Print media was going fine, and I've been, at this point, hanging on ever since, And so what I decided to do with this book, I'd thought about doing a book for a long time, but I never had a specific subject. I didn't want to write a book about Spanish wine or a book about another sort of wine 101 book, because there are a bunch of them out there, some of which are very good. But I started getting much more interested in how things were farmed in terms of wine. I don't know if anybody knows the name Wendell Berry. He's a farmer in Kentucky and a poet and an essayist about agriculture. He's also was a good friend of my family, so there was a long tradition of kind of, my father at least, being interested in ecology and agriculture and how man and nature interact together. And I started seeing more and more happening in the context of wine about, like, how should we grow grapes? What is the way to do this that will be beneficial to the planet rather than potentially damaging? And additionally, with wine, how do you farm in a way that will allow you to express the place if that's what you want to do? Because that's an interesting question. I'll get to that in a minute. And then I also had that sense that there were wines out there that really spoke to me, and then wines that were perfectly nice but kind of mass market. And I write all the time about 10 or 12 or 15 buck, fairly large production wines in the magazine, because this is what we as consumers buy a lot. And I wanted to make the point that they're not, that's always existed in wine. And it's fine. Like, go forth and drink whatever you like to drink it. It's like, if I'm mowing the lawn in Texas on a hot summer day and someone hands me a Budweiser, I don't care if it's craft beer or not. I'm going to be thrilled. It's like, thank you. I needed that. So I do worry sometimes that there's a little bit of like the pretentiousness around wine can sneak in. But I do think also there's this realm of wines that are expressive of place and character and expressive of the people who are making them that are kind of what I fell in love with in this thing. And so those two things came together, and then about 3 years later resulted in this crazy thing. And there are a couple things about this book. There's nobody in this. So the book is kind of some introductory material, and then a lot of profiles of wineries around the world and the people who work there, who are working in the ways that I think are really interesting and are making wines that I think are great. So there's no wines in the book that I don't think are terrific. There's no one in the book that I didn't talk to personally, sometimes not at their vineyard, occasionally in New York or in California at an event. There was a caveat made for Zoom calls during the pandemic. My travel plans, when we tried traveling in 2020, it really didn't work so well. So my travel plans were a little bit thrown up in the air by the pandemic. But nobody in here I didn't talk to. No wines in here I didn't taste. And the majority of the book is wines that are, let's say, probably 20 to 45 bucks, let's say, going up to about 100 with a few kind of a little bit above that. I really wanted to write a book that was about wines that people could go out and buy, not a wine. I mean, yes, if you're Elon Musk, you can go out and buy any wine you want. That's fine. You want to buy, if you're him, you buy a $5,000 wine. It's like, I dropped a nickel. Sorry. It's really alarming. I think what's the classic Bill Gates thing that back when Bill Gates, before he retired, like if a $100 bill was on the ground, the time it took him to stop and pick it up was time away from work, and it wasn't even worth it for him to do it because he was earning so much money, which I find mind-blowing and definitely not what you get out of being a wine journalist. I'll just say, I will be stopping to pick up the $100. I'll stop for anything. But So wherever I was going with that, that's what I wanted to write. Was a book that really gave people wines they could go out and find that did have this kind of depth to them and did have this kind of character, but didn't cost a fortune, because there's a lot of wine out there that costs a lot of money, and so. A bottle of Domaine Romanée-Conti Montrachet, which is one of the most expensive wines in the world, is $5,000 a bottle. That's a lot of money for a bottle of wine. I'm not spending that. And I'd rather give people 20 or 30 buck bottles of wine that are really exciting and expressive at the same time. So I thought I'd read a couple of the profiles in the book of just people that I thought were really cool and making great wine at the same time. And to give a kind of a sense of what, who are these people out there? So one of them is a woman named Chiara Boscus. Is anybody a Barolo fan? Anybody drink Barolo? Yeah, okay, good. Chiara Boscus makes amazing Barolo. Barolo is from Piedmont in Italy. How many people out there collect wine? Couple people. How many people drink wine relatively regularly? Okay. Has anybody never had wine before? Because if you haven't, and you go out after this and you have some wine, it's really cool stuff. You're going to enjoy it. It's really good. Barolo, so Piedmont, northern Italy, northwestern Italy, sort of west and south of Milan. Barolo is one of the great red wines of Italy. It's made from the Nebbiolo grape. The quote was the wine of kings and the king of wines. It's powerful and long-lasting and honestly really terrific. And Chiara Boscus makes, under the E period Pira label, makes brilliant Barolo. And she's also a very lively character. And I thought I'd just read a little bit about her. So Chiara Boscus crackles with energy. Whether she's talking about her wines or her project to bring life back to a tiny mountain town in Castelmagno, or about being a woman in the very male-dominated world of Piedmont winemaking, she's fiercely animated and also fiercely funny. Boscus first hit visibility as a member of the Barolo Boys group in the early 90s. She was, needless to say, the only woman in the group, because it was called the Barolo Boys. The group, all friends and all winemakers, did a lot of experimentation in the vineyard and in the cellar. Notoriously, Elio Autare, another member, chainsawed his family's old wooden tanks into pieces and replaced them with French oak barriques. He was then disinherited, though it's completely true, though later his sisters did give the estate back to him. The winemakers in the Barolo Boys group were rebelling against the poor vineyard practices at the time, high yields, and often defective or oxidative winemaking that marked a lot of Barolo back then. And that rebellion got them a lot of attention. What's probably more revolutionary in Boscus's case, outside of the fact that she's a stupendously talented winemaker, is that she fought her way to the top ranks of Barolo at a time when women were, in many ways, and in fact in almost every way, barred from that course. She says, "My father always said to me, 'Why do you like to be the first in line? In the first line, you get the bullet in the head. But I say that if you're in the first line, you get there first.'" She adds, "In my generation, there were no women in the cellar. It was heavy, heavy work. That's why I bought machines so early to move things, because the attitude, it was, if you want to be like a man, okay, work like a man, move that barrique." At that time, when they saw a woman who wanted to act like a man, people were not very approving. For years, I was working like crazy, 7 days a week, every night. The boys in Barolo, which means the boys in the town of Barolo, which is the heart of Barolo, not the Barolo Boys group, but the boys in the town, would be in the front of the winery at the bar, watching me work late at night cleaning tanks, and they'd be saying, hey, you're never going to get married." Well, I'd say, certainly not to you. Boscus farms 27 acres of vines in Barolo, Serralunga, and Monforte d'Alba. It's a holistic approach. We use a worm-digested compost from a place called Worm Up. It costs 2,000 euros per hectare, so, $2,000 for 2.2 acres. So that's 20,000 euros of worm shit every year. But it's the best shit. I also have a lot of hotels for birds, hotels for insects, a lot of work with plants and birds, plants for birds and insects to eat. We don't do atomic war with a cannon of chemicals. We use bows and arrows. And so that's what I wanted to do with this book was give not. There's so many wine books out there that are so technical and so geeky that you pick them up and you read a few pages, and this is me as a wine writer, and you're like instantly starting to feel your head do this thing, you know. And I wanted to write a book that was really about wine, but about the people in wine too. And I wanted to capture their characters. And so a lot of this book is people in their own words talking about why they farm the way they do, how they got to where they were, whether that was, you know, I went to grad school and I changed my mind completely and I got into wine, or my family like left Switzerland during the 100 Years' War because we were being executed right and left, and we moved to Alsace and we started, you know, as barrel builders and then gradually worked into wine. So there's that whole range of histories in wine. Europe's goes back much farther than ours does, but I really wanted to capture this kind of passion that I think the best winemakers really bring to the project, whether they're women or men or families or multi-generational families or just started recently. And so she's there's some people I knew I was going to have in this book to start. She was one of them because I've met her before, and she really is like this incredibly magnetic, intense person. But so there's some people but there's a lot of people that are well known that I left out of the book too, and part of that is because of that cutoff in terms of price point. You know, there are some very famous wineries, all the first gross of Bordeaux, Domaine Romanée-Conti, to give one example, in Burgundy, who work kind of the ways that I'm talking about here. Or take Domaine Leflaive, one of the great Burgundy producers. Their basic Bourgogne Blanc is $125 a bottle. Their Grand Cru Burgundies are $800 or $900 a bottle. That's not what I wanted to get to in this book. I wanted to get to people who were, I didn't really care if they were incredibly famous and established. I only cared if they were making great wine, and that it was at least in the realm of semi-affordable, you know. I think probably the most expensive wines in the book are Spotswood, which is a wonderful Napa Valley Cabernet producer, whose main wine is $225 a bottle, but they make a $85 second Cabernet called Lindenhurst, which is a killer bottle of wine for the price. Napa, by the way, Napa Valley, the average price of a Napa Valley Cabernet these days is about $90, which if you look at the price of grapes in Napa Valley, it's a massive change from when I was getting into wine. I got into wine learning about Napa Valley wines. Now, if you see, there are some out there that are more affordable than that, but the average is right around there, and it's Napa's pricing itself out of people learning about wine from Napa Valley wine. On the other hand, there's Paso Robles and Sonoma and, a whole lot of other places to go. So, let me read one other Italian producer. I haven't been keeping track too much of how much time we've got. But, what? We're good? All right, we're good. Thanks. So this is another Barolo producer, totally different story, but this Barolo producer, and the name of the family is G.D. Vajra, V-A-J-R-A. A different story, but there's a quote in here that again was one of my guiding sort of things for the book, and I'll just read you a little bit about it. So I interviewed Giuseppe Vajra, who's running the winery now, who's the son of the founder, and Giuseppe said, after World War II, my grandfather and my grandmother were young and broke and in love. My grandfather had been among those who stood up to Mussolini, so because he'd been part of the resistance, he was able to get a job in the Italian Defense Department. But that moving from the Langhe, and the Langhe is sort of the heart of the Barolo region, to the city, to Torino. So that's where my dad grew up. But my dad always had this crazy dream of being a farmer, like the way you dream about being an astronaut or a race car driver. He wanted to be a farmer. And then in 1968, he got caught on the street during the youth protests. And so my grandfather sent him back to the family farm to keep him out of trouble. And that's when the seed exploded. He was on the family farm. The Vajra estate is located in Vernier, the highest village in the commune of Barolo. The family has farmed there, growing crops and grapes and other crops since the 1880s. The name at the time, and up until the 1960s, was the more traditional Piemontese, Vajra. They shifted from a V-A-I-R-A to V-A-J-R-A. I still don't know why, but apparently it's a big difference. Aldo Vajra was 15 when he was sent back to the farm, when he was in the youth riots. He was sent back at 15. By 1971, when he was 18, he was studying viticulture and had converted the estate, which at the time was selling grapes to other producers, not making wine, to organic farming. And that's really early in the realm of organic farming, certainly for farming in Italy. The Viras were among the first, if not the first, in Piedmont to head that direction. My father was fortunate to have a professor who was early in the movement to do chemical-free farming, Giuseppe Vira says. But they had to meet after hours in the professor's office to discuss the topic, because all of the university's agricultural research was being funded by chemical companies at the time. Aldo Vira became a viticulture instructor, and, as Giuseppe says, luckily, he found the only woman crazy enough to marry him, which was my mother. She came from a farming family, so she understood him, and together they created the winery. This was not an easy task. At the time in Piedmont, the only lands with real value were the flatlands, and the hillsides and the vineyards were for the poor. And this is true all over Europe. The flatlands where you grew your row crops, your grains and everything, and vines, which will literally grow anywhere, were always on the poor soil up on the sides. And when Aldo Vira finally decided to make wine rather than grow grapes, it was in 1972, which was a spectacularly bad year in Barolo. Like horrible, horrible vintage. Essentially, the weather forced his hand. He said, I had grapes, but in 1972, no one wanted them, so I had to make them into wine myself. I also have to thank my uncle. About the 1972 vintage, he said, listen, Aldo, if you manage to sell this wine, we have to go out for a nice dinner. But sell it fast, because it's going to be dead by summer. This is not what you would call an auspicious start. Despite that, the young farmer persevered, and nature rewarded him in 1975 with what he recalls as his first magical vintage. I can still taste that wine. All the flavors in the world, like a candy. Which always makes, and the minute he said that to me, I instantly flashed to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and there's like the everlasting gobstopper that has all the flavors in the world. I was like, that's a cool random thing. Today, Vira farms close to 100 acres of vines. This is a family effort. Aldo and Milena still oversee everything, but their children, Giuseppe, Francesca, and Isidoro, are part of the equation. It's a gravitational pull. Giuseppe says, at 15, I wanted to be a heart surgeon. I even passed my medical exams. But I was wary of working in a winery. And I asked, Dad, what is the social purpose of what you do? And he said, Giuseppe, if you want to save lives, go be a doctor. We don't save lives. You don't need art or poetry or a glass of wine in order to stay alive. But what's the point of life without those things? That's the night I decided to devote myself to making wine. And I just, that line, you don't need art or poetry or a glass of wine in order to stay alive. It's completely true, but what's the point of life without those things? So that was, again, one of those quotes I got early on in the book that kind of drove what I was thinking about. And it also drives a little bit of, when you think about organic farming or regenerative farming or biodynamic farming, wine exists in a kind of a special place because, and I realize this may be shocking, we won't die if we don't get wine. We'll all kind of, it's me, maybe a couple people out there possibly, but realistically, if it all goes away tomorrow, we'll be fine. This is not true of rice or wheat or corn or any staples, where you're trying to literally feed 5 billion people on planet Earth. So wine, and there's one other thing about wine, which is that with wine, if you're trying to make really good wine, you're never trying to farm for the most production possible, because vines produce the best grapes for wine when they're somewhat stressed and they're somewhat pulled back on the amount of production they can actually do. So you don't really want to, for instance, in California, you don't want 12 tons of grapes per acre. You want it really to be around 3 or 4, let's say. So wine is in this interesting place where it can kind of experiment with alternative forms of farming without the pressure of having to produce as much crop as possible, economically and it's sort of world stability wise. And so you can farm organically in wine or regeneratively. And one of the things the book does, I hope, is explain those terms fairly quickly and intelligently, because it's completely baffling from a bottle of wine to know what's organic, what's not organic, what's sustainable, et cetera. But wine has this freedom to farm a little differently and to farm a little bit kind of at the edges of what we do, which I think is important. It's almost like it's kind of out there on the edge, testing what the possibilities are. Does anybody know what biodynamics is? A couple people? No one. Okay. So quickly, sustainability is essentially trying to farm in ways that, let's say, help the earth in your farm to some degree, keep your plants alive without too much use of chemicals, with some exceptions, and also, try to reduce your energy footprint by using solar power, trying to reduce your carbon footprint a bit, treat your workers well. Sustainability, the other thing about sustainability, a grape farmer in California said to me that one key thing about sustainability is economic sustainability. You have to be profitable, because if you're not economically sustainable, you go out of business and none of the other stuff matters, because then you're done. Organics is basically so with conventional farming, you tend to treat problems with systemic chemicals, whether it's pesticides or fertilizers or things like that. Organics tries to treat the same problems with non-systemic chemical products. Chemicals are still used, sulfur, copper sulfate, those are all traditional organic products for treating mildew and mold problems in vineyards, but you're not using Roundup or Furion, or I'll take your pick of whatever systemic chemicals. Biodynamics is a completely weird but interesting school of organics, I guess is the way you'd say it. It was invented by an Austrian philosopher named Rudolf Steiner in the 1910s, 1920s. Steiner was a very odd dude. He believed a lot of weird things. He believed England was not moored to the surface of the earth. Go figure. It seems to me that it is, but he thought that. He invented the Waldorf schools, if anybody's familiar with Waldorf schools. But he had one really great idea in amidst all the kind of kooky stuff he did, which was to think of a farm, and he wasn't even thinking necessarily of vineyards, but think of the farm as an ecological whole, so that you're not just looking at the plant in the ground, but you're looking at the birds, the bees, the impact of the sunlight. You're looking at the life under the surface, the worms, the bugs, et cetera. And it's all one interactive whole thing. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. And his approach was to kind of, by kind of strengthening the life of the entire farm, you strengthen the ability of the plant, the vine or whatever it is, to resist disease and resist problems. And you work kind of holistically. He has some very kooky ways of doing this, but there are a lot of very smart people in wine who've shifted to biodynamics. And the best quote I had about it, I think, is from Olivier Zinn-Tumbrecht, who's a wonderful winemaker in Alsace, who's both a master in agronomy, masters in winemaking, master of wine, which is an insanely difficult thing to get in terms of wine knowledge. And he said, I'm trained as a scientist, and when I started thinking about biodynamics, what I did was I made several different plots and farmed some conventionally and some organically and some biodynamically, and I did different manure piles, literally, or compost piles. And I would check, it's a standard compost pile, organic compost pile, biodynamic compost pile. And I could measure, like, within just the microbial life, if you measured across them, the one in the biodynamic pile was massively higher in terms of kind of living soil, in terms of microbial life under the surface. And he said, as a scientist, if I can measure it, I don't necessarily have to be able to explain it. As long as there's a measurable difference there, I mean, part of science is we're confronted with these things we don't know how to answer. The fact that we don't know how to answer why it happens doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. If we can measure that it happens, something is going on there. And the trick then is to figure out why. And they followed that up by saying, like, I don't know why humans exist on Earth necessarily, but we know they do exist on Earth. So biodynamics has got some kooky aspects, got some fascinating aspects as well. And then recently what people talk about as regenerative farming, which has been referred to as biodynamics without the woo-woo, So it borrows from biodynamics that kind of idea of the farm as a coherent whole, looks at carbon capture a lot, and living soil a lot. So there's a lot of use of cover crops, year-round cover crops. And then it all borrows from sustainability, this idea that you also need to use energy wisely, treat your workers well, treat your animals well. And so it's kind of a combo platter of those things. Anyway, it explains it all in the book, much better than I just did, but there it is. And then, so let me read one more, maybe two more. How much time do we have left? 1 minute? One more. I'll read one. It's a tough one. I was trying to figure out which. I'll read this one because this didn't necessarily influence the rest of the book, but it came. I was on a wine trip to Georgia, not the state of, but the country of. So there are no wine trips to the state of Georgia. I will tell you. It's a certain kind of humidity and hotness. You pretty much wine's out of the question. Weirdly, if you grow grapes, if you grow grapevines in Thailand, it's so warm and humid you'll get 2 crops a year. But they're garbage grapes. They're horrible for wine. Anyway, I went to Georgia. Georgia's a fascinating country. It's former USSR. It is this saddle between, the Caucasus Mountains and then Russia on one side and Turkey and Azerbaijan, and then it's this crossing point between the Far East, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Russia. It's been overrun by everybody. The Georgians just kind of fight back, and it's utterly beautiful. The Caucasus are absolutely spectacular mountains. Weirdly, the best cucumbers I've ever eaten in my life in Georgia. So if you're a super duper cucumber fan, go to Georgia. But they also make wine, and they've been making wine they've been making wine since the start, because the oldest archaeological evidence of winemaking is at an archaeological site called Gadakrili Gora, which is outside Tbilisi in Georgia. I've been there. I stood there. It looks like most archaeological sites. It looks like a big pit in the ground with some lumps. But it is, in fact, they determined the oldest evidence, 8,000 years ago, people were making wine there. They had stone urns, basically. They were putting in grapes, sealing them up. The yeasts on the skins of the grapes were fermenting the grapes, and they were literally making wine. And so it was very cool to stand there and be aware that, like, I'm writing about wine, and 8,000 years ago, some Neolithic Georgian was standing in the same place making wine. It was a moment, as a wine writer, it was a big moment for me. But there's a long history of Georgian wine being made in monasteries there, and I went to one called Shavnabada. And I'm sad to say right now the Shavnabada wines are not in the U.S. because the importer who was bringing them in went out of business. We'll see if they come back in. When I started the book, they were in the U.S. Now they're not. They don't make much wine anyway, but I felt this story said something about wine and about why we love it and how it affects us. So I'll just read. And I think of these as stories, I guess, in a sense. It's a book with 280 little stories. So here's the legend. In 1795, when the Persian army was encamped outside Tbilisi, every night a man on a horse wearing a black sheep's wool cloak would appear amid the sleeping troops and kill dozens of them, then vanish. This, the legend goes, was St. George, the savior of the country. His cloak, the black cloak, was named Shavi-Nabadi in Georgian, hence the name of Shavnabada Mountain, the monastery atop it, and today the wine made by the monks who live there. This is Eastern Orthodox monks. Brother Marcus, the bearded young monk in charge of winemaking, says, "We don't make a lot of wine. We're not a tourist-oriented cellar. If you show your wine to too many people, the wine understands and leaves." Like, okay, Brother Marcus. At Shavnabada, wine is spiritual. Brother Marcus again, we don't filter our red wine or use any additives. That's not a respectful thing to do to wine. It's the blood of Jesus Christ. The monastery, which dates from the 1100s, is quiet. Only 11 monks live here, and the mood is respectfully silent. You're as likely to hear the wind creaking in the trees or a solitary bird singing as you are to hear someone speak. But Brother Marcus isn't averse to discussing the Shavnabada wines. He learned winemaking from a Georgian biologist who had retreated from society. He'd had a hard life. His son had been killed by the KGB, so he left Tbilisi and moved to the country. When I met him, he treated me as if I were his son. He knew all the grasses, all the herbs in the forest, the trees, the vines, but now his knowledge is gone, except for what I carry on. In the cellar, the monastery's keveries, and those are these big urns, stoneware urns, 7 feet tall, holding 400 gallons each, are buried in the earthen floor. A 200-year-old vat made from a single piece of a linden tree trunk fills part of the room. Brother Marcus prefers that you don't spit when you taste, which, if you believe that wine is tied directly to God, seems like an entirely reasonable request. The thought-provoking aspect of tasting wine at Shavnabada is that even if you're not religious, you can't help but feel the tie that wine has to spirituality. Our purpose as monks is to make people happy, he says. It's not to make money. We put our soul and our heart into our wine, and that's why it's different. God is always present in this process. When asked if he ever thinks about people thousands of miles away drinking his wine, he adds, there is a God, and God is everywhere in the world. We don't have to see each other to have that connection. And that, I thought, was this kind of extraordinary thing to think about wine, that there's, from his point of view as a monk, that's tied to God. God is everywhere. And so if someone's drinking his wine 6,000 miles away in Denver, it's not really that far at all. And I think that's a little bit of a sense of what wine can be, whether you believe in whether you're Eastern Orthodox or whether you just love wine, there's a way it connects us and it can kind of extend throughout people's lives. And so that's kind of what I wanted to get at in this book. And thanks. And I can answer questions or whatever you want, but I'll end on that note. Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah. We're going to bring a mic around so that other people can hear the questions too. Right?
A 60 Minutes show on wine
Yeah.
one time, and they were talking about the changing climate is affecting the wine growing. And I wonder if you've seen whether these people are always inventing something new so that they try to keep up with the change, because they talked about places in France where had wine for generations and they stopped making wine because it wasn't.
Yeah. So, everybody hear the question? Yep, good. So, lots and lots and lots of winemakers in the book have lots and lots to say about changes in climate and changes in weather. Pretty much around the world, you're seeing harvest dates move earlier in the year for grapes. I mean, grapes typically, they're dormant in the winter. They kind of come back to life in the spring. You get bud break late spring, produces bunches of grapes. You harvest in September or October, let's say. There's been this constant march backwards where you're now getting a lot of harvests in places that used to be in October or in late September. Places that used to be in early September are now in August. It's really screwing up the French holiday season for winemakers. But it's very worrisome. But more than that, and there are a lot of quotes in here about this because it's affecting a lot of wine-producing regions. A guy, Olivier Haag at Weingut Fritz Haag in Germany said, we used to be that we'd have 9 out of 10 harvests that were basically what we expected. Wasn't always good, but it wasn't weird. And we'd have one that was completely off the wall. And now it's more like we get 9 weird harvests and 1 that's normal. And so there's this. And you see this everywhere. You see it with, forest fires in California that are affecting, grape growing there dramatically. You see it with, problems in Germany with in a sense, you're getting shifts in climate where you can't plant the same grapes in the same places that you used to. You have to move them around. Southern France, too much heat. You got vines dying or grapes raisinating all the time. Weirdly, there's some places that have benefited from this. There's actually very good English sparkling wine right now, and 60 years ago, you couldn't get grapes ripe enough in England to make a wine, but certainly not a Chardonnay or Pinot Noir-based wine that was worth drinking in the slightest. And now that little 1 to 2 degree shift has resulted in quite good sparkling wine. You're also seeing pretty much most of the big champagne houses buying land in England, which is fascinating. Jancis Robinson, who's a major wine critic, just posted about tasting wine from Poland recently, which is like, I mean, Poland shouldn't be able to grow grapes for wine. It's freezing in Poland. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of concern about it, and a lot of like, what do we do to adapt to this? You know, if Napa Valley gets too hot to make the kind of Cabernet that it's made in the past, what does that mean for Napa Valley? Do we plant Syrah? You know, it's so it's if you read the book, there's a lot of talk about it. I mean, so many winemakers talked about it, and it's just an ongoing concern. Other questions? Yeah.
Some years ago, when I was working, I spent some time in Southwest Texas and encountered some very nice white wines, and I don't drink white wines very often.
Yeah.
And they were grown there, or produced there from grapes grown there. And they said, we've discovered that we can control the sugar content in the wine because all of our fields are irrigated. We can cut off the water anytime we want and produce a really high sugar grape that makes a really good white wine. I haven't heard a word about that since, and so in the words of Ricky Ricardo, what happened?
Well, there's actually, it may be that just people aren't talking about it the same way. You can absolutely, in fact, precision irrigation is a big thing in grape farming for wine. It's a little tricky in Europe because there are rules about irrigation in Europe. In wine regions, European wine regions have very strict rules about everything, about what you can grow and where you can grow it, and all this kind of thing. Texas, it was probably hill country, I would guess. I mean, outside Austin, little west. So the two main places in Texas are the high plains outside Lubbock and the hill country outside Austin. And it's actually, this goes back to something. Unfortunately, okay, this is going to be a roundabout answer, but I'm going to get there. The book is really long. I wrote even more than the book that I have here. The Scribners, my publisher, wonderful people, very much wanted to keep the price at $50 or under. And when I turned in the manuscript, which was longer than they asked for, my editor was like, we have to talk. So I cut about 40,000 words out of this book, which is like a small book out of a book. Among the pieces that went were the rest of the U.S. other than the West Coast. So I actually had some Texas wineries in there. You need irrigation in Texas to grow good grapes. You can't, it's too hot for too much of the year. But you can definitely, with irrigation, control the amount of sugar ripeness you're getting. The problem is that you're still going to get, if it gets too hot, even with controlling the irrigation, you're still going to get either raisination of the grapes, or you're going to get grapes that where you're, so to put this, what you're looking for with grapes is you're looking for sugar ripeness and what they call phenolic ripeness, which is the skins and seeds kind of ripening in a way that you avoid green flavors and you get the kind of classic flavors you want in wine. You want them to kind of come together at the right time in the right place. And some grapes do better in some regions than other regions based on heat. Riesling is a cold climate grape. It goes great in cool climates. Syrah is a warm climate grape. You can grow it in Morocco. It'll be great. So a lot of it is finding the right grape. So even if the temperature goes up a bit, you can still grow grapes and make good wine. The trick is if your entire reputation, like 85% of the New Zealand wine that comes to the U.S. is Sauvignon Blanc. So if your entire reputation is based on Sauvignon Blanc and your climate shifts to where Sauvignon Blanc isn't so good anymore and you need to grow Chardonnay, you've got a big trade issue for your business. I don't think wine's going to disappear. I think even if we might disappear before wine disappears, but I think the grapes and wines we associate with the places, that's what everybody in here is worried about to some degree. The grapes and wines you associate with places that have a cultural history and have an identity to them may not be the grapes that are the grapes for those places anymore. And similarly, you may get places coming online like England that couldn't grow grapes before that were worth a damn, and now they're worth it. So it's a really complicated and fascinating question, but you can absolutely control it with irrigation, and you control it also with your canopy management, with how you deal, because grapevine bunches, leaves. If you prune, there's a lot of, one German winemaker said to me, we farm, but it's really like a form of precision gardening. You know, it's super detail oriented, and so you can trim the canopy of the grapes to let in more light or less light, as the case may be. You know, that's what you get in New Zealand. So everybody knows New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc has that kind of green peppery character. You can control that. That comes from, okay, this is getting geeky for a second, but I'm just going to geek out. That comes from pyrazines, which are naturally occurring compounds in the skins of grapes. You get them in Cabernet Sauvignon. You get them in Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc is actually a parent of Cabernet Sauvignon. But you can control the pyrazine level to some degree by how much UV light and how much light hits those grapes. So through canopy management, you can intensify or lower that kind of green pepperiness. And so there's all sorts of things that play into this. The tricky part is if your region is Napa Valley and its reputation and income is founded on $300 a bottle Cabernet, it's tricky when things start to shift because it's been stable for a long time. So, you know, we'll see, I guess, is the answer. But believe me, people are adapting as best they can. And sometimes, you know, you get weird problems. Like, for instance, in the Loire, you've got warmer winters these days, so you're getting bud break earlier, but you're weirdly getting frost at the same time you used to. So your frosts are hitting when the buds are already out instead of before, which is bad because it just kills the buds. At the same time, in Barolo, you know, a couple of Barolo makers are like, yeah, we used to get like 3 out of 10 vintages, 4 out of 10 vintages that were too cold and horrible, and now it's more like 1 or 2. So, you know, it's a big variability all over the place. I don't know if that answered the question, but it's a stab at it. Okay, good. There you go.
All right.